Hey guys, I wanted to add on to my last video about the different ways, different symbiotic relationships. So I never put this in that last video. This is a good summary, but there was also some things about competition I didn't get into. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about Keystone, species engineer, ecosystem engineers, and a little bit about let's see what was at the bottom here, a little bit about succession. So just because it's part of this slides here in that island biogeography, remember we did that lab with the pieces of paper. Um, so again, I'm just gonna, not randomly but kind of certain days, I'm gonna just put these 10-minute videos up reviewing some concepts, so it just is fresher in your mind going into the test, even though we still got over a month. All right, so anyways, there you go. Competition, can be negative for both, but there's resource partitioning, which I'm just going to outline here quick, can help improve that, especially over generations. Predation, the predator benefits, and the one that's being the prey does not. Parasites, they benefit, and the host does not. Um, this is when omnivores or herbivores eat plants, essentially. So, think of deer, they benefit, and the plants do not. Mutualism, they both benefit. And then commensalism, where one benefits and one doesn't really have any effect at all, like a tree where birds live, for example. There could be benefits or negatives, but in general, that's the example we talked about. All right. And mutualism, sometimes I think of, cleaner shrimp, right? So the shrimp clean up corals or other fish, and, that benefits the shrimp and the other fish or the coral. Anyways, all right. One thing I did want to talk about was resource partitioning. So I'm going to have to actually use this. I don't have really slides for this. Let's see here. Those are all my daughter's drawings here. All right. Nope, I want another one. Create a new one. There we go. All right. Here we go. All right. So we'll go with, I don't know, this color. I like this color. All right. So basically, there's three ways. If there's competition between species in the same environment, same ecosystem, same area. So the first way that species or organisms can deal with competition is something I said in that last video. Is organisms can use resources at different times. So the analogy, or not the analogy, the example I used in our notes and that we talked about was coyotes and wolves, for example. Coyotes tend to hunt mostly at night. Coyotes at night, wolves during the day, as an example. Okay, so you have animals that exist in the same ecosystem, same areas, regions that are awake during the day, hunting, doing their thing, and then you have the nocturnal animals, right? So that's just another example too. Anyways, use resources at different times of the day, let's say. Second thing here, I'm trying to keep this brief. Spatial resource partitioning, it's called. So spatial meaning, different parts or areas of the area or region. And the analogy I used was like in a desert, you have certain plants with shallow roots, and then you have certain plants with deeper roots. So they're not using the same water sources, as an example, right? And you can even go into a forest and you have organisms living in one area using resources and organisms living in another area using a different resource, for example. All right. Or, actually, yeah, we'll leave it at that. Let's see here. What else do I? Oh, another thing with the spatial was, like lily pads. They live on top of the water, obviously, and you have other plants under the water or at the edge of the water. So just again, different spaces or areas in the same region or using resources in different spaces, right? Spatial, different areas. Number 3 here, the morphological resource partitioning. Essentially, that's the evolution of body type, right? So giraffes, anteaters as an example. And what else did I have there? Elephants. I wrote, and the finches of Galapagos Islands. There's all types of different finches, but their beaks have evolved over time to eat different types of seeds in the way they open the seeds, for example. So that's a morphological change, right? So these are ways that competition can be figured out essentially between different species or even the same type of species. They evolve differently so that they can all exist, right? And they can all benefit and, figure things out essentially. So using them at different times, different spaces or different areas within a region or ecosystem, and then the evolution of the body type morphologically, right? So like anteaters can obviously get at ants much easier than other animals because of their big long nose, for example. All right. So I just wanted to talk about that briefly here because I felt like that was important to remind you of. So competition can be negative. They can figure it out over time. And I showed you that slide of the overlapping. And over time, the one species stopped eating a certain size nut or seed. I forget what it was, but these are just specific ways resource partitioning occurs. All right. So if we go back to this here. All right. So now, how am I going to do this? I guess I need my keyboard. No, here we go. Keystone species and ecosystem engineer. Just a real quick review. Species not very abundant, large effect on ecological community, and the ecosystem engineer is a keystone species, but it maintains habitat, right? So beavers, we talked about beavers. They create the dams that create the environment. They create the ecosystem, so they're considered both. A prairie dog does the same thing, digging all those tunnels and turning the soil and allows insects and all these other little creatures to use those tunnels. So that's another example. Alligators are keystone species. They keep other species populations under control because they eat them. I'm trying to think of some other ones here. Starfish are keystone species. They actually eat mussels. So if mussels become too plentiful, then starfish eat them, so there's more space on the rocks. Ironically, mussels are also keystone species in their own right because they clean the water, filter the water. So, what were some other ones here? Coral, keystone species. There's fish, I think like a parrotfish, I want to say, eats and cleans up the coral. That doesn't eat the coral, but it eats little organisms off the coral. There's other organisms in the ocean that eat the small microscopic or maybe a little bit bigger particles in the water that affects the turbidity so that more light can get through. So they can increase photosynthesis at deeper areas. That increases the depth of photosynthesis when organisms like, I want to say plankton, do that. All right, they clean up the water so that more light can get through. So anyways, I just wanted to refresh your memory on those. All right, real quick on succession here. So you got your primary and you got your secondary, and the biggest difference here, primary, you start on rock, right? You have rock, and eventually lichens and mosses will grow on them, and they secrete acids, which get more nutrients out of the rock and break them down. And slowly over time, you get little flowers, little plants, shrubs, smaller trees, and then bigger trees once it starts to mature over time. Obviously, you can read this here, but basically that's what primary is. You start with exposed rock, and the lichen and algae and mosses start to break that down. They can get nutrients out of the rock very slowly. So this is very common. It says New England. So like basically where we live, it says this is the result of that, right? So a lot of the forests. Okay. All right. And then secondary succession. Secondary succession occurs that have been disturbed but not lost their soil, right? So if you have a natural disaster, tornado, hurricane, or earthquake, I don't know, something that kind of really destroys the environment, but you don't break it down to rocks, right? You still have dirt essentially and soil. That's what secondary is. So it's not starting from rocks. It's essentially starting from here, the annual wildflower. So your first two steps in the primary are gone. Now you're starting here, but the flowers, you still have the dirt and soil, and then you continue from there. Okay. So basically, it's just a shorter version of the primary success. So primary, you start with rocks. Secondary, you start with dirt, soil. All right. And then in aquatic ecosystem succession over time, eventually they will fill in because the increasing vegetation and then increasing accumulation of sediments, eventually over time, it'll become more filled in. So, early on, it's just water, not a lot of plants, not a lot of sediment, not a lot happening. And again, over time, and this takes a long, long time, hundreds of thousands of years, they slowly fill in with sediments and become terrestrial habitats eventually, right? So that was another type of succession. And then while I'm on this these slides here, it's important to understand, and we didn't. I don't think I have that slide. No, there's another in the other chapter. It talks about richness, and diversity. But really, I just wanted to sum this up with the island of biogeography. It's kind of not connected to the other stuff, but just really quick here. Dual importance of habitat size and distance, and the whole point of that lab was the bigger islands, the closer to mainland, and the bigger the island, the more species richness it'll have, right? So it'll have more species of birds, right? Island area. So the larger the area, but also the closer to mainland. And I don't have that picture of it here, but again, if you're close to mainland, then it's easy, for example, birds to get there. And if it's far from mainland, then it's harder for birds to get there. And if the island is very small, then obviously there's not going to be enough space, and competition will affect how many different species of birds, right? So the larger the island, closer to mainland, that would be the best case scenario for species richness and diversity, which is basically the same concept there. So that was it. I just wanted to review that with you guys. And how am I doing here? There we go. That's it.